okay? But remember, as we study this topic, as uncomfortable as it gets, as graphic as it will get, and believe me when I say that it could be a lot worse, because if I really wanted to cover how graphic it could be, like I could take you in directions that would make you want to run out of the classroom crying. And I'm not going to do that, but it is going to get graphic enough that we understand the gravity of the subject. So remember that as a historian, you don't have to fix history. You just have to study it. But so we're going to talk about slavery all week. We're going to talk about slavery in the Middle Passage today. We're going to talk about what enslavement looks like in America, on American soil in the 19th century. And then we're going to talk about the Underground Railroad on Friday. So this is going to be the week that we cover this whole really uncomfortable topic. And then we'll go back into the expansion of America with this knowledge that this is something that's happening. Okay, so let's talk about slavery. So the first thing I want to make clear about slavery is it wasn't new. It wasn't new to America by any stretch of the imagination. Slavery was considered a common social institution in most societies. Slavery was just, I mean, it's written into, you read about slaves in the Bible, you read about slaves in ancient Mesopotamia. The entire Code of Hammurabi has to do with how to treat your slaves. The institution of actually owning the work and life of another person has been around for a long time, okay? But American slavery was different, and we're going to explain why. The slavery that we have on the plantations in southern North America was drastically different from the slavery that had been around for thousands of years before that, and we're going to explain why. So in order to do that, we have to go kind of back to Africa, and we have to point out what similarities there were between Africa when slavery started to come into Europe and Europe when slavery started to come into Europe. And the truth is there really aren't any differences. When we're talking about the era in which slavery happened, African slavery happened for Europeans, they were both basically living in places that looked like this. Feudal Europe looked like this. Villages with housing made out of whatever local materials were available, people who worked agriculturally for people who owned more than they did, families living together, telling each other stories, making each other clothes. You know, all of these things were very, very similar. There was no class difference between your standard European village and your standard African village. They had their big urban centers, and so did Europe. They had places where people were rich and wealthy and lived luxurious lives, and places where people didn't, just like Europe did. Other than that, there was no difference. So first of all, we have to set aside the idea that slavery happened to the Africans because they were more primitive. They weren't. They were the same level of development across the board until they weren't, okay? So we'll talk a little bit about the history of Africa. Primitive societies formed in Africa just like they formed everywhere else. It started with families that turned into villages. Villages were allied together and networked together, and then villages became alliances, which became trading empires, and then those trading empires became trading partners with each other. In Africa, most of the trading empire parts formed around rivers. This is the Niger River that runs through here, and the Nile River that runs up through here. And then in South Africa, the tribal people that fled from the spreading empires formed into sort of nomadic communities called the Bantu states. But around the Niger River was a very sophisticated empire, the Songhai Empire, which formed around Timbuktu, around the great trading center of Timbuktu, and was strong enough of a trading power that it rivaled Rome, that it rivaled the Mesopotamian, the ancient Greeks. When they traded with the Songhai Empire, they were trading with equals, okay? But slavery was a part of that system. Slavery was part of a justice system in Africa, as it was in many places. It was part of a justice system. You became a slave by a process that you had agreed to be a part of as a part of the community. People became slaves because they had to pay for a crime. They were sentenced to slavery because they had committed a crime. And you knew that committing the crime, that you were running the risk of being imprisoned or enslaved for committing that crime. People were enslaved because they went into debt. And that was one of the dangers of going into debt, is that if you couldn't pay the debt back, you or some member of your family might end up being enslaved to pay that debt back. Okay? Or you became a slave because your defense system was weaker than somebody else's offense system. Your village's defenses were not as strong as somebody else's, and then when they fought a battle with you, you lost. And so you become a prisoner of war. And there's a certain amount of pride in that, because prisoners of war were almost always people who had been willing to fight, but then had lost the fight. And so were now serving their sentence as a slave as a way of winning back that honor. So slavery was always part of a justice system to which everybody participated. There's no question about who were the humans and who weren't in this system. You didn't become a slave because you were a lesser person. You didn't become a slave because you were an inferior race. You became a slave because you lost a battle, or because you went into debt, or because you committed a crime. And wealthier lords could actually purchase the debts of others, gather them like collection agencies. They gathered the debts of others so that they could build up their own wealth. So I might be a small person with a small business who has extended credit to like Savannah and Jordan, and they both went into debt to me, and now I own them because, you know, they can't pay off their debts. But if I really want to get rich, then I can sell their debt to Agnes over there, who is now their new owner, along with the 7 other debts that she has purchased. Now she has 9 slaves that belong to her. And it was possible to trade these things, and you wouldn't have any say in that because, you know, you're still trying to pay off your debt. Okay, slavery was part of a system that everybody participated in. Okay, do you understand? Okay, so what changed? Well, in 1497, and I don't, this slide isn't on there for some reason, I'm gonna have to fix it. That's annoying. In 1497, Henry the Navigator sailed from Portugal, or funded sailing from Portugal. He didn't always do it himself. He was the younger son of the prince of the King of Portugal, and younger brother of the King of Portugal. And he went around the coast of Africa and just kind of explored and made alliances and made trade deals with people who are there on the coast. And one of the things that he found out was that one of the goods that they had to sell were actually working slaves. And that was an interesting idea. Europeans found out about this slightly later than, say, Islamic people and Muslims found out about this, because they were trading down into northern Africa. And purchasing slaves was one way to, it was a commodity you had to trade. If I have to trade for weapons and all I own is slaves, then I'm going to give you slaves in exchange for weapons, and then I'm going to have better weapons. So that's basically what happened, is that the European powers began to trade inland for weapons for the slaves that the coastal powers had. The coastal chiefs had slaves to trade for things. And then the coastal chiefs ran out of slaves to trade, but still wanted more weapons. So they went and got more slaves. Well, the problem is that this is part of a justice system. So in order to go and get more slaves, you have to find more people who are willing to go into debt to you, or find more criminals who are willing to commit crimes, or take raiding parties into more villages, which by now have built up their own defenses, so it gets harder to do that. The only way to supply the demand for these new weapons that the Portuguese were selling and the other European powers were selling was to bend these rules somewhat and come up with more ways to acquire slaves. And when Spanish settlers began to start plantations that were extremely labor heavy in the Caribbean, and the demand for slaves went through the roof, suddenly the chiefs on the coast have to come up with new ways to come up with slaves to sell to them, because the demand just gets bigger and bigger. Indigo plantations, sugarcane plantations, the life expectancy is extremely low. Most slaves who come into a sugar plantation have a life expectancy of less than 10 years. Not even really time to have another generation of slaves usually. because the work itself is incredibly hard and the processing is incredibly dangerous. So I was watching, what was I watching? A miniseries not too long ago called The Long Song about a Caribbean slave plantation that was growing sugar, and all of the slaves on this plantation had burns on them. And the reason for that is because processing the sugarcane is extremely dangerous. So you need lots of slaves to do it, and the slaves keep dying. So you go back to Africa and try to get more slaves. And in the midst of that, their justice system to produce slaves collapses. And they're just outright kidnapping people. Okay? So what do you have to do inside your head to make that okay? To make it okay to kidnap people? Anybody? Make them seem like a lesser thing. Yes, make them seem like a subspecies. Make them seem like they're not equal to you. To begin to treat them like animals that you can herd rather than actual people. So that's basically what happens. Oh, it is here. It is in the wrong place. Weird. Okay. Yeah. What basically happens is that the first introduction of slavery in the North American colonies is in Jamestown, which, if you'll remember, was the place where John Rolfe found that his pocket full of tobacco seeds actually grew really well in Virginia. And suddenly he was growing tobacco in large amounts and needed the labor. They tried to get locals to help with the labor, but the locals were not amenable to working for no reason. For the local Native Americans were not, they would get sick really fast because they had been exposed to smallpox and things like that, which Africa has been exposed to because it's been a trading empire this whole time. So they would bring diseases to the Native Americans, the Native Americans would die, and then the Native Americans would just refuse to work too, which was something sort of, you know, annoying if you were trying to grow tobacco, if your labor force just refuses to work. So that hadn't worked out very well. And then a Portuguese ship that brought 20 or so Africans and sold them to the Jamestown colony, the same way that they sold them off the chief. So it's like, this person has a debt that they're trying to pay off. They have a contract. I bought the contract. I'm selling you the contract. That was the first slaves that came into Jamestown. And we know that they weren't being treated as a subspecies yet at this point because of a lot of the literature around the 1600s. When Shakespeare wrote Othello, okay, have y'all ever heard of Othello, the play Othello? That is, the starring role character there is a Moor, which was the English way of saying a black person, who was a brilliant war strategist who was allowed in the first act of the play to marry the daughter of the wealthiest person in town. We know that at the time that they had not started doing this yet, that they had not started thinking of them as a subspecies yet. And the first slaves in Jamestown had a contract that would run out. They could pay off their debt. Their children were not born as slaves. The children that they had in Jamestown were not automatically born as slaves. They were born free. So the first slavery in Jamestown, but the demand for labor becomes so big, so quickly, that that shift actually takes place, where they start outright kidnapping people, bringing them to the coast, trading them with the Europeans bring them back. And once you start to think of them as an animal instead of a person, how you treat them gets worse and worse and worse and worse, which is what brings us to the Middle Passage. Okay, so the Middle Passage is called the Middle Passage because it's one leg of the triangle trade, okay? Slaves go to America, sugar goes to, from the slaves work the sugar plantations, the sugar goes to New England, sugar gets turned into rum and other goods, and that goes back to Africa. So it's part of a triangle. Another way of looking at it is this. The slaves go to the cotton fields, and then all of the goods get traded to Europe because mercantilism, and then they use that to go down and pull more slaves out of Africa. But this leg is always called the Middle Passage because this is the leg that transports slaves from Africa to the Americas. Okay, so it's called the Middle Passage. And at first, the Middle Passage was just a transport of people to people, okay, people to locations, people to plantations. And so they were treated as people. They were captive people, but they were still people. But we're going to see how that gets worse and worse and worse the more they're treated like animals. Over the course of, oh, what is this? Let me think. This is probably 1619 to 1820. You can see that this is a massive diaspora. This is a massive group of people. And most of them go to those Caribbean plantations. Like a huge number of them go to those Caribbean plantations because the life expectancy is just so low. Not as many, but still, you know, 200,000, 128,000 go to the North American colonies where they're, you know, cotton plantations and stuff. But most of them go to the Caribbean to die, okay? And to South America to work in Brazil and to die on the plantations there. But by the time we're finished, we're talking about 10 million people who are displaced from Africa and moved into slavery in the Americas. Okay, so what happens when you start treating a person as though they are not a person and are cattle instead? First of all, cattle don't have names. They don't have identities. When you put a herd together, you don't keep track of which calf came from which mother. You just put a herd together. Okay, you just lump them together and then you drive them wherever they need to go. So the first thing that happens is the people are stripped of their identity. Okay, and then they are transported as cattle. They are moved, they are restricted in their movements, moved as a large group. They are protected as an investment, and it's important to recognize that that protection is not kind to them. They are prevented from harming themselves in ways that are actually themselves very painful. And then they are secured against any action that might liberate them, which could be dangerous and lose your investment. So they're protected as an investment by being held captive. And then they are bought and sold as though they have no agency of their own. They're treated as though they have no right to make any decisions about any of this. They can't negotiate for their own freedom because they are a commodity that is bought and sold. So I have a clip of Amistad, which I was going to show you, that demonstrates the middle passage. I think I'm going to wait until the last 10 minutes of the class so that anybody who just can't take it can just shut it off. So I'll wait to do that. But we're going to talk about some of the things that happen on the middle passage. First of all, people are moved in what's called a coffle, which is a way of stringing several people along together so that you only have to like basically keep track of one of them and they all stay together. Sometimes this was accomplished by beams that connected to each other's necks. Sometimes this was a string of chains, but it was moving them along in a line against their will and connecting them to each other. That's called a coffle, and that usually comes up as a test question, so something to consider. One of the ways that they were stripped of their identity was to be branded and given a new identity. So that often happened on the African coast before they started being transported across. They were assessed on their physical strengths. They were assessed on their physical bodies and then, you know, categorized that way. So what you ended up with often was several young men of the same age pulled from 12 different tribes who didn't know how to speak to each other because they're not being lumped together based on where they come from, or they're being lumped together based on their height or their muscle structure or their strength. So you ended up being taken away from your own family. If you were kidnapped as 2 or 3 people, you know, from the same family, you'd end up being separated from your family on the basis of the fact that you were different people. So you would end up being lumped together with people who were similar to you and didn't speak the language you spoke. So especially with young people, that was extremely difficult, which you'll read about. As this is probably the part that bothers me the most. I don't know about y'all, but when the Middle Passage began, slaves traveled with something that's called loose packing, which was they had this much room in the base of the ship, so that's how many people they put in there. And that was enough room for them to move around, to get up, to sit down, to lay down. You know, it was like a prison cell, like a holding cell in a jail. You know, it wasn't so much the underdeck where the slaves were was room for them to move around. And as a result, probably about 10% of them died on the journey as a result of the travel restrictions. Somebody figured out, if you do the math, that you could tight pack instead of loose packing, and you would lose maybe 40%, but you would still have a lot more when you reach land than you had when you started. You'd make less trips, more people would die, but you would end up with more product when you arrived in the Caribbean to sell. So ships begin to be structured with what's called tight packing, which is basically you bring the coffle of slaves in, you rope them down, you chain them to the floor, and they stay there for the journey, which is usually about a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks, sometimes more if storms got in the way. And you would be fed very little, but whatever food you had would be. Anyway, this, I don't know about this image here. I see this image a lot, and it bothers me just from a physics standpoint. Like, I'm not sure if this is real, but you can see what you're looking at here, right? These are feet and these are heads, that they're actually stacked on top of each other. But this is an actual schematic. This is not a pro-abolitionist, anti-slave schematic. This is actually a how-to of how to tight pack a ship in a manual. So this is actually just something. This was the lower level, and this was the level above them. So there was one more level above them. So underneath them would have been another row of people. So anyway, you can do that because they're not people, they're animals, right? They're cattle. You get them in any way that you can. There were slave fortresses on the African coast who specialized in, gathering all these slaves from the countryside and bringing them in and trading them for the goods. And then they would tight pack the ships, and then the ships would go to the Caribbean. On the journey, there were certain actions that were taken to protect their investment. For example, dancing the slaves, which was a thing that was done to make sure that some of your more robust slaves exercised so that they would sell for more when they arrived. And the way that they did this was by whipping their feet until they agreed to move. That was called dancing the slaves. I know that I always, as a younger person, I quit asking this question because the answer just got so ugly. Why didn't they just resist? Why didn't they just resist? Why didn't they just jump overboard? Why would they put up with this behavior? And the answer is, for pretty much every form of resistance that you can think of, the traders had come up with a way to prevent it. So this is a speculum oris for people who refuse to eat. If you are a captive slave and you are basically planning to starve yourself so that you don't have to live a life of slavery, one of the ways you can do that is by refusing to eat. This is a device that's made specifically to force you to eat against your will. If you try to bite, claw, fight your way out of captivity, they have devices specifically for that. The kinds of things that you would put on a biting animal in order to prevent them to bite. If you tried to jump overboard, and this part, I actually had somebody walk out of my class, so I apologize for this. This is horrible, but it's true. If you think that jumping overboard is an option, you should be aware that probably around every slave ship is netting specifically to bring back people who jump overboard and then punish them. To make an example out of yourself so that other slaves won't get the idea that that's an option for them. You jump overboard, you end up tangled up in the nets, they bring you back up, and then they punish you severely. And also early in the trip, it doesn't hurt if you take one person and sacrifice them and throw them overboard and then bring them back up to show what happens when sharks follow a slave-thing ship, so that people won't think that jumping overboard is going to be an easy death, because the sharks are following the ship. You can do all of this because these aren't people. So, millions of people, and here's the slave traffic list, were moved from Africa to America using this pattern, okay? But the part that I want you to remember is that the only reason it was justifiable to anybody was because at some point there was a shift in what a slave actually was. A slave was not somebody paying for a debt, paying off a crime, or suffering the after effects of a war that they couldn't win. It was just somebody who had been kidnapped and it was an animal, it was cattle, it was somebody who was no longer a human being. And that as a result, it's just a commodity to be moved, that has no identity, that has no intelligence, that has no future anyway, that had no destiny of its own. All that individualism that we talked about, The Enlightenment in the 1700s, that doesn't apply to this group of people in America. And that's what makes American slavery different. So every time we start to talk about slavery, there's always somebody on social media who's like, but the Irish though. And I just want to smack them because like, it's different. The Irish who were enslaved were indentured servants. They were people who had fallen into debt and then their parents had sold them as slaves as a result. It was different. Every other form of slavery was different than this one, okay? But that idea that this group of people is a subspecies, that this group of people is a different race, is a lower creature, nestles itself into the American psyche and stays there. Even after slavery ends, the idea that this group of people is an inferior race is written deep in the DNA of America because of this. This is an incredibly uncomfortable thing for Americans to come to terms with, but it's true. They're not an inferior species, they're humans, but we still have that deep in our psyche because it took an entire several hundred years of justification to be okay with what happened here. Okay, are you all with me so far? Would you rather not be? I'm sorry, this is all. Okay, anybody have any thoughts or questions about any of this? Just sad? Okay, well, I would say, well, luckily that's the only time we're going to talk about it, but it's not, so. Okay, so generally at this point what I do is I show a clip from Amistad that shows the middle passage in all of its glory. I don't have an assignment for you tonight because your test is still due. So basically what I'm planning to do now is show that clip of Amistad.